Hi everybody. This video is going to discuss the evaluation table and the application of a qualitative research article. So remember with the evidence table, as we talked about before, we have these findings. So as we peruse through articles, read it thoroughly the first time and take notes, and then you can go back and start putting data in here. But this is just a cut and paste, your author's year, the journal name, and then the article name. We always want to get the purpose and the problem. And so let's just go to the article really quick and we'll work through these things. The nice thing about this article is, the title tells me right here it's a qualitative study. That's pretty handy. So remember the abstract. It's a succinct overview of the study, which are lovely, but again, you have to go into more, read the article for more detail. But it tells us the background or what they've found pretty much in the literature review or what they've seen. And we're worried a little bit here about effective instruction, especially with newer folks. They're with newer instructors, or in this case, nursing students transitioning to the role of clinical educator, clinical instructors. They talk about the purpose, they talk about it's a qualitative study, the sample, and how they analyze the data, and that they found three main themes. So remember, with qualitative, we're looking at words, and as contrasted with quantitative, where we look at numbers. So the background, again, tells us what the problem is. And here they're talking about how nursing, constantly undergoing evolution, transformations, we really have to teach both didactic, theoretical, and practical education to ensure our students are receiving what they need to be able to go out and hit the floor running. So therefore, there's a great need for national clinical nursing instructors who can effectively deliver these dual approaches of teaching theory and practical and clinical to be able to be effective towards our future nurses. So they talk about that. That says find definitions. They talk about new graduate nurses who are employed as nursing demonstrators and clinical educators. This is a study from Saudi Arabia, so their terminology is a little bit different. You need to read through that and understand the definitions. What is it? Because that will help you know, oh wait, can we use this study in the United States as well? Which we can. Pedagogy, you MSN educators will certainly know what this means by the time you get done with school. So you just need to keep track of the different terms so you understand how they are in context with this study. So research study context, speaking of, it explains what this study is about. Remember, with qualitative research, we are looking at gaining an in-depth understanding of some phenomena, and this study describes how clinical instructors use planning, implementation, feedback loops, and reflection frameworks to apply research-based teaching, and it also examines effective pedagogy used during the field experience. So this is a bunch of variables here: planning, implementation, feedback loops, reflection frameworks. You have to again, look for the definitions in this study and put them in context, because we often use the same words, but with different research studies, whatever, or situations, the context is different. So this is the design. It talks about a qualitative. So overall, we know it's a qualitative, but the subtype really is an interpretive, explanatory, instrumental case study design. So again, I would take some notes. What does this really mean? So you have an understanding. But the goal, again, was to gain a deeper understanding of issues. They talk a little bit about the case selection, and let's go down here because that goes into it a little bit more. So the sampling and the participants. So they talked about the folks, the demonstrators and the clinical instructors in their first semester of teaching were assigned. However, they explained how their schedule was assigned. I know the def of the clinical instructor and also demonstrators. I had to write that in there, and then I highlighted what they meant by this. Here's the demonstrators. Anyways, it's a little bit different system, but actually it's transferable to the United States and probably other countries as well. Oops. They talked about the participants, which was N20. It was a purposive sampling, which is what qualitative does. We don't randomize. We have purposive sampling. And these were instructors who were going to attend a preparation and clinical teaching training workshop. And then they talk about the aim of this workshop, which was to help these folks get going, to prepare them, to instruct and familiarize themselves with selected methods of clinical teaching and instructing at a mastery level. Okay, so that tells us a little bit more about the participants. This tells us about the settings and the procedures, so it goes into a little bit more how these folks, the novice educators, attended a 1-week preparation clinical teaching workshop. So you could consider that your independent variable. And what impact or how did this workshop affect all these dependent variables? In other words, outcome variables. Let me see here. They talk a little bit about the mentors. They talk about what they did. They start talking about how they collected data. Remember that data collection and data analysis are simultaneous in a qualitative study. So they had semi-structured interview question guide. And they talked about how they were conducted in private rooms, and they listed some of the questions here. Okay, this is a nice section because it does talk about the methods to assure rigor, and that's a strength of this study, how they talked about that, because trustworthiness is critical in a qualitative study, as it is in a quantitative too. They also talked about, they followed the steps by Lincoln and Guba. These two are the two gurus of qualitative studies way back when. And they set up a lot of the procedures that qualitative people now follow. Okay, so and they talk about the specific things, dependability, conformability, all those types of things that we know are important to qualitative studies. So data analysis, I might as well have just highlighted the whole article. These guys had a lot of data sources that they chose from. They also talked about, let me see here, how they analyzed it even further. Member checking, field notes, observational notes. They had the transcripts transcribed verbatim. They read them repeatedly. Their data sources were lots of things. List of question instructional practices. They had semi-structured interviews. So this is a pretty thorough study. Okay, so by using multiple data sources, triangulation was achieved. And if you don't know what that is, again, look that up, but that's an important word for qualitative studies when we're talking about data analysis. But they did constant comparison. This is how they analyzed it as well, triangulation, constant comparison. And they did open coding here as well, and those codes were categorized based on their similarities. And from all this in the end, and they use multiple data sources and multiple expert reviewers to ensure consistency of the study's analysis and findings. So again, this is very thorough. In the end, what they found, this is important, they obviously addressed it. Their research findings was they found three central themes: the need for learning about research-based pedagogy, support mechanisms to implement innovative teaching strategies, and transitioning from nursing student to nursing clinical instructors. This is what they found that our novices need. And this sounds pretty darn typical of new instructors anywhere in the world. Okay. Sorry, I'm flipping around. What happens then with qualitative studies? Because they're so wordy. They talk about each theme, and this is very important. So again, remember how quantitative has all numbers that they talk about. Here's where in qualitative we talk about each theme and what they found. Okay? So I'm moving through that pretty quickly, but they did break them out into each theme and talked about them specifically. But what I want to get through here was the discussion. So they talked about the findings, and now they're going to discuss those findings. They talk again about the aim of the study was to describe how clinical instructors use the planning, implementation, feedback loops, reflection frameworks to apply the research-based teaching and examine effective pedagogy using during their field experiences or while they're teaching. And then they talk about, oh geez, a little bit more. They found out what these people really needed. They talked about the participants expressed fear and anxiety in regarding failure and attempting to apply any new methods. In other words, they lacked some confidence, a little bit of a high anxiety there. They felt they were under pressure when they joined the school because not only did they have to teach, they had to engage in scholarly activities, and that's a hard thing, and we know that's a challenge. So they went through some of these. They expanded more on the discussions and the findings here as well. So they talked about conclusions. They talked about future research and, what we can do here to help folks out. And they also address the limitations of the study. And just remember, any qualitative study, the limitation is always the external reliability, which is the ability to generalize the findings or transfer the findings to the entire population. But honestly, this study, I think, is really applicable. Its clinical significance is quite applicable because I think we could utilize this in any educational setting when we bring novices on. The other thing, this was done in a different language, so these researchers were English or American, but what they did was they, did they got all their interviews and everything, and then they translated it to English, and then they translated it back. And sometimes you lose maybe some of that. You have to realize you may lose, not the findings, but something gets lost in translation. But again, they did have member checking and all those types of thorough qualitative data analyses that we do to try to prevent that. Okay, so let's go to the evidence table. So what we have is the problem. We have effective teaching with new nurse educators struggling with the rules or the dual rules of clinical instructor and theory. The purpose of the study was to describe how clinical instructors use planning, implementation, feedback loops, reflection to apply research-based nursing, and also looked at effective pedagogy. The biggest thing here is you've got to read the articles clearly so you understand what these mean. It was a qualitative, interpretive, and explanatory instrumental case study design. It was N20. The sample was purposive. They attended a 1-week workshop to prepare them for clinical teaching and theoretical teaching as well. Participation was voluntary. In other words, anybody can drop out when they want as well. The workshop, the major variables were the workshop, the 1-week workshop, and then all these things I just mentioned over here. So remember, your purpose and problem, or your purpose needs to really match up with your variables to match up with your findings as well. Okay, so here's the measurement of the variables. They had a ton. They had multiple data sources, which we talked about. The list of question instructional practices, semi-structured interviews. They did more in-depth interviews. They, they had so many things. I only listed a few. So with data analysis, again, analysis and collection occur at the same time. They did open coding. They did constant comparison. They talked about, they transcribed all the interviews verbatim. They looked at how they, with their open coding, they categorized similar concepts. And then they found, they also used triangulation, which I have right down here. And in the end, then, they found 3 central themes. So overall, there is some planning, there is some implementation, feedback loops, etc., that is done by these novice instructors. But there's some issues. They have some concerns. They have a lack of confidence and anxiety from teaching research-based strategies. They have concerns about participation with scholarly activities. There's lack of experience. Totally understanding. And some of them talked about they feel the need for support. There's a lack of incompetence. And in the other end, these guys need some help and support, and the workshop was set up to do that. So the appraisal, the limitations again, is the ability to generalize. But clinically significant, I think they are able to. The strengths, they really talked about the rigor of the study. They had multiple data, and the AACN level was C.